Ed, I feel rejuvenated as a Marvel fan. Like, oh, you guys thought I was overboard with the Marvel bias? Oh, it's going to be ridiculous from now.
Marvel flag is flying high this episode.
So freaking high. And I'm excited because, man, we're back to our roots. You know, we've had a lot of these episodes to kind of branch off, especially with the community involvement, but I'm really excited for our diehard, not just Marvel heads, but for sure the Marvel heads, but our comic book diehard collectors, fans, and etc. I think this episode right here, man, this one's for them, for sure. Let's take a step back because we might have some new listeners joining us for the first time, and I want to tell them welcome. You are now listening to the Short Box Podcast, Jacksonville, Florida's premier comic book and pop culture podcast. I'm your host, Bader Milligan. I got my right-hand man, Edmund Danzart, with us, and we have a guest today that, Ed, I said this on the show, we've had comic book writers, artists, editors, inkers, colorists. We've had people who work in the business side of comic books. But the guest we've had on today, I mean, he's a freelance writer. He's a comic historian. And he could possibly be like the watcher or the collector.
Yes.
Like, like he could give them a run for their money. The amount of information this guy has is amazing. So we have a guest on who has done a lot of work with the official handbooks of the Marvel Universe, Marvel Index books. You are about to get a crash course into some of the importance of continuity, which I don't think we've done enough justice on this show, talking about the importance of continuity and just comic book timelines. So I'm excited to start this episode. His name is Paul. But before we begin, I do want to say, if you're joining us for the first time and you're not subscribed to the show, do yourself a favor, pause this episode, subscribe, go on our official website, shortboxjacks.com. We've got links to iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher Radio, Google Play, iHeart, basically anywhere that you can find podcasts, you can find us. To search the Short Box, the Short Box Jacks, or the Short Boxers will pop up. Hit that subscribe button. It's free. It'll make your life easier to stay up to date with us. And not only that, but Ed here is in charge of our social media accounts, and he does a fantastic job posting some interesting and funny things on there. So follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and start this episode. The Short Box Podcast is proud to present episode 198, The Tacoverse.
It is indeed a great pleasure to present to you at this particular time the hardest working man in show business. Man, this thing ought to go crazy.
Let's go. Not your Suicide Squad, that's some comic book guys. Back again, another round, safe to say we take the prize. Not a stranger to this thing, no 11, just normal guys. Smooth pop culture, comic game vultures. The L we baby, not just outright golden. You already know how we do for those who know us. iTunes, the Short Box, come on and join us. It's not a secret to the world that we taking over. So with this war, Dr. Doom, and yeah, the wait is over. So fan girls and fan boys, welcome to season 4. We got exactly what you need, make yourself at home. Season champions ready to give you so much more. Ladies and gents, let's begin. This is season 4. Yeah, the Short Box. Ha. Let's go, let's go. Elevated music. No. Season 4. Let's go.
Has everyone seen the Avengers trailer? Because I've lost my mind like at least 5 times in an hour rewatching that. It is incredible, man.
Yes.
Like, I don't know if it's just because of all of the stars in this trailer, or if they're just doing a trailer right. I'm trying to figure out, is this like an exceptional trailer, or is it just because of the names behind it?
I think it's all of that, all of the above.
Because I was geeking out pretty hard when Captain America was holding Thanos' hand.
Oh, yeah.
Like, come on. Like, someone is going to die. Like,
oh, man.
Multiple. There might be
a sad movie.
I'm putting my money.
Vision. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't.
Vision's an easy one, and it's an easy loss because it can be rebuilt.
Yes.
Yeah, good point.
Hawkeye.
I won't be
Stay
crying.
home,
With that logic, I won't be crying when he passes away. And Hawkeye as well. He's getting old, man.
Stay home with the bow and arrow. What are you going to do?
But I've got my money on Iron Man and Vision biting the bullet. in this movie. I'm feeling kind of confident about that. I was talking to Drew about like the Marvel MCU universe and what makes it so. Besides just really spectacular movies, I think there's an element of when you're reading the comic books, you know that these characters, at least in comic book form, will more than likely outlive you, and they'll probably be the same character. It'll always be Steve Rogers as Cap, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that you've got going on with the MCU is, and I got a brain fart, but dude who plays Captain America won't always play Captain America. He's going to get old. They're going to have to do something.
Contracts are going to
expire. Yeah. So I think that leaves them with a lot of power over the comics where they can make these dramatic changes, and they kind of have to stick with it.
That's why they're laying the seeds for each subsequent chapter that they're doing, and they're on chapter 3 now. And so they're introducing new characters like Black Panther, who's just popular off the charts, and so they're hoping that they can fill in those original characters that were extremely popular with new ones, and I think they're doing a very good job of that. I think now that they've gotten the franchise for all the Fox properties.
Oh boy!
You're going to see, another arc built around Fantastic Four. You're going to see an arc. They're going to be introducing X-Men. Totally new revamp. Yep. So the MCU is just going to continue to live on and prosper, and it doesn't necessarily need Robert Downey Jr. to do that.
Yep. No. Now, Paul, I know you've got a soft spot for Captain America, but what's been your favorite MCU film of the freaking 30 that we've got?
I've tended to like, out of each of the ones, Captain America 3. Captain America 3, Thor 3. Actually, Iron Man 3. A lot of people like Iron Man 1 better. But,
you might be the first anyone. Not just guest, but anyone that's ever said that. Yeah.
What I liked about that one was he had to rely on his own wits and his own ingenuity and didn't have the armor the whole time, which I kind of liked. There's the annoying kid.
I feel sorry for that kid in just real life.
But it's kind of like how he handles the annoying kid is kind of funny.
Yeah. So, Paul, so we got this tradition on the show that when we have new guests and first-timers on the podcast, normally our co-host Cesar Cordero, he does this tradition, but I'll go ahead and take over. And it's just to go ahead and bridge that gap between whether we've got, just like in Marvel Comics, back in when Stan Lee was writing it, he always wrote it with the idea of any new reader could be joining us for the first time, so I'll do a quick recap. But why is this story important? We kind of do the same thing here on the podcast. Where we try to bridge the gap of new listeners joining us and maybe someone that isn't familiar with you, and they're looking at the episode a description, they're like, who the hell's Paul? So I got to ask Paul, for our listeners tuning in right now, who are you, what do you do, and why should they care?
Okay. I was a freelance writer for Marvel for 5 years. 2010 to 2015, didn't do creative work, but did a lot of work on research and writing of material that documents the Marvel Universe. And this is material that not only is important for fans out there, but also Marvel writers themselves use these books as reference pieces.
At least the good writers do.
Yeah,
good writers.
Yeah, the good writers. Some of them are like, we don't care about that stuff. We just want to do our own thing. And then afterwards, it's left up to us to try to make sense out of all of that, and to bring it in and to explain kind of what it is, if there are discrepancies between one portrayal and another, if there's some factual thing that happens that contradicts something else, we kind of have to make sense of that whole thing. So we document the glue that holds together the Marvel Universe.
They actually care about continuity, everyone, despite what you may read.
But so I got into it in a roundabout way. I started collecting Marvel Comics exclusively in 1969. So this is the tail end of the Silver Age and beginning of the Bronze Age. So I was right in on that stuff, and I was just enjoying the heck out of this stuff as a kid. And one thing that just fascinated me in reading these comics were the fact that there were these characters who were appearing in more than one comic. And it's like, okay, well, this person shows up here, but I saw him last over here, and kind of how is that person's life kind of progressing? Where are they appearing chronologically, one appearance after another? And that really kind of got me excited about the grander Marvel universe and not just caring about one particular title. Although I had my favorites, and they were Captain America and the Avengers. But kind of as characters kind of came into those books, and I'm wondering, okay, what's the backstory of this character? And, so that interconnectedness, the fact that all these issues were not kind of one-offs and didn't have any repercussion in the progression of the entire fictional universe really grabbed my attention as a kid. As I got older and could afford to spend more money on comics, I started to amass a collection, which I still have. I have to rent a storage unit for it.
Oh, wow.
But lots of stuff that I was just totally geeking out on, all of these different titles. But what really started to inspire me is in the 1970s, a fellow by the name of George Olszewski. I don't know that that's going to make that name's going to make ring any bells for anybody out there, but George Olszewski was not in the comic business. I think his background was in computers, and I think he went to become a paleontologist, actually. But what he did have for 14 years, he was the only individual on Earth who had a copy of every Marvel superhero comic from Marvel Comics #1, 1939.
Wow.
Holy crap.
Yeah. And so, after a while, I'm sure you say, okay, what should I do with all this stuff? And he started to think, maybe I should document it, create an index for every one of these issues that I have. And so, I ought to document things like, what's the title of the story? What are the creators, the writer, the editor, the inker, the letterer, the artist responsible for these? How many pages are we talking about in these stories? If there's more than one story, what were the titles? What were the number of pages? What characters appeared in each of these stories? What objects of significance appeared in these stories? What locations were depicted in each of these stories? And so what he was starting to do is build an index of all of these materials. And what he came out with, I've got an example here, something called a Marvel Comics Index. Now, this is something that he got permission to do from Marvel, but it's not a Marvel product. It was independently published. He did this from 76 to 82. And as you can see, Bado's going through it right now. It's the very type of information I was talking about. You have an illustration of the cover, and then you have all of these stats and information about each issue.
And I'm sorry to know, are all these issues from his personal collection?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
So I imagine that he's copy from the comics to the covers themselves from his collection?
So he was doing the photography on that from his own collection.
Wow.
And this was a lot harder to do back in the day. This was before digital pre-press.
Very much harder to do.
It's got a gorgeous Neil Adams cover.
Yeah.
That is a spectacular Neil Adams cover.
Yeah, so he got
This is really cool.
Marvel's blessing to do this, as long as Marvel didn't have to pay the cost of producing it.
So wait, did this come out of his own pockets?
So this was basically self-published. It was through, I can't remember the name of the group. It was G&T Enterprises that was producing this. I don't know how many of these were done, but when I learned of this stuff, I started picking these up, and I'm saying, wow, this is great. And one reason it's really great is because, you can go to one issue and you can say, okay, here's a listing of the characters who appeared here, and then he starts to say, you know what? This character last appeared in this issue of this other title.
Oh, wow.
I just imagine this dude in a basement with a bunch of strings to pictures.
Posted
What?
Yeah.
like a detective show, just pictures
I can't
everywhere.
I can't even tell you what I did last week. Wow.
And so, this really started to inspire me. And then George actually got a contract with Marvel to do this officially for Marvel. And this was done. I've got an example here of the official index to Avengers. They only ended up doing Avengers and X-Men. The sales just weren't there to continue the process. But this was done in the 1980s.
Can I say that his self-published looks way better. Like, a lot better. I like.
But of
Al
course,
Milgrom
this has color in it.
and larger covers.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
larger covers.
I might take it back.
Yeah, so that series really got me hooked into the concept of a Marvel chronology. So taking each character in the Marvel universe and then not from the perspective of what they appeared in publication order, but what they appeared in their lives in the Marvel Comics universe. So following one character from one issue to the next. And also, it gets a lot more complicated than that because as time goes by, we discover that characters will appear in several pages of one issue of one title, and then they'll move on and make a special appearance in another title, another issue, and then you'll see them back again in that title. And so basically, it's not just entire stories, entire issues of comics, one after another, but you're breaking it down page by page, panel by panel, especially when you start introducing the concept of flashbacks, continuity implants, even photographs that you see within the panels
So
in the
Easter
frames,
eggs.
right?
Wow.
Right. So you might see like a picture, let's say of Reed and Sue Richards' wedding. Now, let's say the happy couple, kind of their portrait picture and whatnot. You didn't actually see that in the issue of Fantastic Four Annual where they got married, but they had to have done that. They had to have posed for that photo. So where in that issue where they got married were they posing for that photo? So it gets like tremendously anal in there, and that's to be honest, right up my alley. So so George Olszewski's material appeared in the 1980s. Then the next chapter after that failed, Marvel decided in the 1990s to reintroduce the concept of the index.
Why? Did they feel it was
because they basically, because I think that they needed it for their own writers.
It was the 90s. No one really.
It's like, and this started, a few years before the really bad stuff happened at Marvel in the 90s. But instead of Olszewski, basically a guy by the name of Murray Ward was the chief editor of these particular comics, and so it appeared in comic book format. They did Avengers, they did Fantastic Four, they did Amazing Spider-Man, they did X-Men, and they did Marvel Team Up. In this series here. So, of course, I went out and I collected all of these. And as I was doing this, especially with Olszewski's work, I started to put together my own chronology, a master chronology of the Marvel Universe, taking all of Olszewski's work, all of the work that Murray Wade was doing. And what really got me was the fact that Olszewski would actually nail down a calendar time frame for these issues. So it's not just relative appearances, one after another, a chronology, but he'd actually attach things to a calendar. So, how much time is elapsing since Fantastic Four #1? How many days did it take for that story in that issue to happen? And, what week of what month was this going on in? And so, I started reading this stuff in his work, and I'm like, mind blown, So I'm like, what I'm going to do? I'm going to start in on my own Marvel calendar. And basically do a calendar, month by month, year by year, what's going on each day of each month within the Marvel Universe. And as I was doing that, and as this series, the award series was going on in the 90s, I also caught wind of a brand new website called the Marvel Chronology Project. It's still up. Still going strong. You can find it at chronologyproject.com.
And what's the purpose of the site?
The purpose of the site is started by a fellow in Alabama by the name of Russ Chappell, and he is a kindred spirit to me. Basically, he would create lists of every single character in the Marvel Universe, and you click on that character, and you would see a chronology one title, one issue after another with page delineations and everything else. So if you wanted to pursue that character and see that person's life through Marvel Comics, you would basically go and collect all these comics and read them in that order in order to know kind of what was going on from day to day in that person's life.
Is it up to date now? Like
it's a few years behind. Okay. They're actually catching up to, I think their goal is to catch up to the Secret Wars of 2015. Okay. So when that came along, they were still a few years behind, but they're in the 2010s right now.
Wow. Which is impressive as hell, seeing is how much like time and effort and details. It's insane.
And the proliferation of titles and issues out there. I mean, you have thousands and thousands of comics to keep track of. So
I'm sorry to interject, but how do you... It's not just one guy's collect. This one guy isn't collecting all of these comics, right?
No, so
I'm sure he's relying on other.
So Russ Chappell, the person who started the Chronology Project, he has a distinction of being one of the few people who have every issue that Marvel put out since Fantastic Four #1. So he can actually do a lot of this work himself, and that's how he started the website, just from his own research. Then realized that, you know what, I need some help with this. This is just way more than one person can do. And the website had a forum on it. Back when when I was at home taking care of my infant daughter, looking for ways to kind of start creating my calendar, I had some time on my hands, started writing into the forum. And it wasn't too long before Russ asked me to be one of the founding board of directors on the Marvel Chronology Project. And I just leapt at the chance and was really actively involved until just a few years ago with that site. Along the way, I got to know some fellow board of directors who came on. Most significantly, Jeff York, who actually continues to work for Marvel. You'll find his name in a lot of the reference works that Marvel does. He actually did an internship at Marvel while he was involved with the board of directors at the Chronology Project. Along with Russ and along with Jeff, we had a number of other folks. Darren Jansen, who is critical. He's from Illinois. And Darren is just a spectacular guy. He's really, really into these comics. And he actually is one of the people who actually work for Marvel in just documenting the comics as they come out. They supply him free of charge with comics. Oh. And basically what he does is he basically documents those issues and sends back the information to them for future reference. His collection just, I'm sure, makes mine pale in comparison.
I think it makes everyone I know collecting combined.
Oh man,
Paul, I wanted to take a step back because you might be one of the few guests I know that has brought this much reference material for us to look at, and I'll definitely post some of the pictures I took. But can you talk about some of the titles that you've worked on, specifically for Marvel? Because when I was doing some research, I mean, you've done a bunch of indexes between Avengers, Ghost Rider. I mean, I didn't even know Ghost Rider had an official index. I mean, not that it's saying anything about him, but can you tell us about some of the stuff that you're credited with?
So, talking about the Chronology Project, it was kind of a segue to talking about this because in 2009, Marvel decided to resurrect the Marvel Index yet again. And this had a lot to do with the movies that were coming out at the time. Iron Man. So basically what Marvel wanted to do was they wanted to create an index for those comic titles that were coming out as movies. And so the first set of them were Iron Man, Spider-Man, and X-Men.
Even though two of those were underneath Fox?
This was pre.
This was prior to Marvel having its own movie company. So this was in 2009. They went through that, and they actually got Jeff and Darren on board from Marvel Chronology Project to work on those indexes. I was busy with another project and didn't have the time to spend on that, but when the second batch came around, they were going to do Captain America. They were going to do Avengers. And they were going to do Thor. And I said, God, Captain America and Avengers, my favorite titles. I got to get in on this right now. My other project finished. And I said, what can I do to get involved? And so they said, basically, why don't you send in a writing sample? They gave me an assignment, write up Avengers Annual #2. And do it up in the format that the Index does it. So, I wrote it up, sent it in. They said, well, yeah, it was a little long, but we know you can write, and we'd like you to come on board. And so that's when I came in on the second iteration of those newer indexes. So as I said, it was Captain America, Avengers, and Thor. And the way that would happen is those of us on the team for doing the research and writing these entries into these, we basically got to pick what we wanted to do. So it's like, okay, next issue's coming out. And they originally came out in comic book format. And each issue was devoted, a third of it to Avengers, a third of it to Thor, a third of it to Captain America. And they said, okay, we're probably going to end up covering issues X to X of each of these comics in the next go-round. So they just kind of threw it out there. Does anyone have a preference for covering things? And then people would call dibs on various things, and then the things that nobody wanted kind of were parsed out. And so it was great because I was able to go to my own collection of comics and reread those with new eyes for the first time, sometimes in decades, that I read these things, and I'm now paying like mind-numbing attention to every detail in these comics and appreciating them on a whole new level, and writing about them. So these official indexes that came out for Avengers, Thor, and Captain America, they ran, I think, 14 issues. Then they collected each one of those into a trade paperback. Wow. So they basically divided it. So it was one for Avengers, one for Captain America, one for Thor. But we had extra assignments for these trade paperbacks. There's new material that are not in the original comic versions of them. So for the Thor one, I get to do all of the Thunderstrike issues, which you didn't find in the original comic book version. So,
that is work.
Yeah. Yep. So doing that, then the third go round came around where they did Wolverine, Punisher, and Ghost Rider, because there were movies coming out for those characters as well. So Jeff York actually took on the sole responsibility for Wolverine. Everything in Wolverine in those things is him.
And you want to talk about some dude's like complicated past? Like, come on, Wolverine.
It's like, and we were like, you can have him, dude, because it's like, that is tremendously complicated. He's one of the most complicated Marvel characters to actually chronicle, because he didn't start in, he started in like halfway through his life, and he had all of this baggage that was never published before that, and then all of these backstory issues and all this kind of stuff. It's like, how do you put all this together?
And they never gave him a solid origin until years later.
No,
not so Origins, right? Paul Jenkins,
right.
Yeah.
So we were like, okay, you can have Wolverine, and the rest of us will work on Punisher and Ghost Rider. That's no problem. So, those continued on for another few years. And then they decided after that third go-round, once again, the index was suspended. But I had my foot in the door, and we were working on other projects. So, I got to work on a couple of handbook assignments, and I brought a couple of these here to the studio.
Is there a difference between the handbooks and the indexes?
Yeah, so the handbooks basically are character-driven.
Okay.
These are what I remember.
The indexes are issue-driven, and the handbooks are character-driven. When it came time to do an update for the handbooks, I was called on to do a number of updates for the characters that had already appeared. So some of my work is in the back on the updates area. I also got to work on Avengers Now handbook, which I've got a copy of here. And again, much the same work is doing research on what's been going on with the character, and from the last time that we actually had a handbook entry for that character. And I was able to do this fairly easily because the entire time, this past couple of decades, I had been working on the Marvel calendar. And the Marvel calendar is something that you can see in part through the Marvel Chronology Project, and that is that month-by-month, day-by-day accounting of everything that was going on in the Marvel Universe. So my work with that really took off and got us to talk about, well, what is Marvel time exactly? You know, and how much time can we really nail down, you know, a calendar for Marvel time? Because, you know, if it were real time, of course, Peter Parker would be in his 50s.
Yeah.
Or actually in his 60s, close to 70. And that's not going to work. But, of course, we know that Marvel time is much slower than actual time. But if you follow, I basically took what George Olszewski did with the calendars, the month-by-month calendars, and I extrapolated that and started working beyond his work, building on what he was doing. And this was in the mid-2000s I was working on this, and I was already up to like year 24 since Fantastic Four #1 started. And so this would have made Peter Parker about 40 years old. And it's like, okay, well, you know, how tenable is that? Not that 40 is old from my perspective, but it got into great debates about, you know, the nature of Marvel time, how that actually works. So, you know, it's just been fascinating discussions all around, interacting with folks from Marvel, lots of fan people and whatnot. It's just been a really interesting ride for me.
Man, I am beating myself up because I don't have the Marvel OG on the show. The Marvel OG is my pops, and he's like, for us, like the premier Marvel guy. He grew up collecting them since like the 60s and 70s. So right now he'd be probably having a nerd explosion of all this information. Man, so let me ask this: why do you think documenting this comic book continuity is so important? Like, how does it contribute to the culture in the larger scheme of things? Well, especially, and I'm sorry, especially considering, and I think me and Ed had our burning question: how does it play into continuity now when we've seen Marvel do a relaunch about every year?
Yeah. And, you know, the great thing about Marvel, and one of the reasons it's been so popular, one is the characterization, but two is the fact that they have, over the years, paid attention, unlike DC.
Really? Because, you know, when you meet DC fans, it always seems like they're really, like, you know, really tight about their continuity, that they really, really?
No. DC's been in all sorts of directions on their continuity. And it's hard to figure out, okay, just what reality are we talking about with DC? Now, Marvel has kind of got in that direction as well, but there's always been this one steady 616 universe. And various writers over the years have had a lot of respect for that continuity. And one thing that fanboys like me really geek out on is the fact that, yeah, this writer paid attention to what was going on with this character decades ago, because some of the threads of what was going on then are actually being tweaked out in stories that they're writing right now. And, you know, treating it like real Earth, the fact that there is a continuity, that you can't entirely ignore the past when you're planning stories for the future, was something that really got me about Marvel in general. And I think that a lot of writers throughout the years have continued to care about that. And Marvel has continued to care about that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to the effort of you know, producing these indexes, these handbooks, because it is extremely important to have that kind of continuity in place. Now, that said, you know, there were times when, you know, Marvel would threaten to destroy the universe and build it anew. I mean, it happened when, you know, Franklin Richards' Pocket Universe was created. And, you know, I actually stopped collecting some of the titles in there. I stopped collecting Avengers. I stopped collecting Captain America during that time period because it wasn't the reality that I knew. And as it turns out, it really wasn't the reality, but it was tied into the reality at the end. At the beginning, when they started that, no one really knew what they were going for here. You know, it was a complete relaunch, and I just kind of collected the titles that were still grounded in the 616 universe. But it all kind of came back around, and they explained it that it was so. You know, even though they tried a new direction and tried to create a brand new universe, they always come back to 616.
Yeah, that's true. It's like the Ultimates universe.
Yeah, the Ultimates. I mean, the Ultimates then, they launched that. And the great thing about Marvel is, we always used to call things that happened in 616 canon. What's a canon story? What is not canon? And then in recent years, when they would launch things like the Ultimates, things like that, they didn't want those stories not to count.
Yeah.
And so they basically started tagging them with alternate reality numbers, and they're part of the Marvel multiverse. And in recent years, those characters started to run into one another, and of course that whole storyline prior to Secret Wars, where all the universes were kind of crashing in on one another and whatnot. And I was hoping that what that would do is really kind of clean house and basically get them to start concentrating a bit more on 616. And some may argue that 616 really no longer exists, and other people say, yes, it does. That's actually when I stopped collecting. Was during Secret Wars, because I'm like, okay, we're doing this again. And at the same time, I ran out of space, quite frankly, with my comic book collection. So, it's like, what? This is a sign to me. And the very last comic I bought was Secret Wars #1. And it was like, okay, this is a good time to just kind of cap
the original or the one that came out in
the one that came out in 2015.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Well, you were collecting up until that point.
I was collecting up until that point. So
damn, that was only like 3 years ago.
Roughly. It's not that long ago.
So every now and then I'll check into a comic store and kind of thumb through and say, what's going on?
It's
now?
funny you say you stopped there, because that's that reminded me of a
lot of people stopped there. I know.
Yeah, because that was a very almost DC-ish type of thing with the multiverse.
That's what I thought.
In this patch, this part, everyone's vampires. Oh, here, everyone's zombie. It's like,
oh man, and all those stories they created, no one could care less about.
Yeah.
It was like,
they did all those spin-off.
It's like,
I worked at a comic store then, so it was like nonstop spin-offs that didn't really matter to the main story. It's like, it was ridiculous.
Yeah, and so it was diluting the really important stuff, and it's just like, what, that's it for me.
So no collecting of new current comics.
No collecting of no new comics,
because the way that I imagine you look at the motivation to buy a comic off the rack differs greatly from mine. I'm looking at, and it might still be the same, but for the sake of the argument, I'm looking at like the writer and the artist combo. The team that I like. And then I'll look at the character. Okay, I do like Spider-Man. I do like this team. I'll give it a shot. I imagine for you, do you go in like, they're fucking up the continuity. I can't give it a shot.
Yeah. For me, sometimes it's really hard to get past the writer and the artist, especially the artist. If I'm thumbing through a comic and I'm like, I am just not digging this art at all. And that's another thing that kind of got me about some of the more recent stuff. It's just like, I'm really old school. I have fond memories of when I was younger and some of the artists that I really appreciated there. And that kind of art really is rare these days. Yeah. And so, that was another reason. But yeah, I would go in there. I would start collecting things because I've got to know this for continuity purposes. And I would start, going through the issues and reading the stories, and I'm like, they didn't quite get that continuity right. Or it's like, okay, how is the Marvel Chronology Project going to explain away this particular detail? And so, and the writers, I think some of the writers at Marvel kind of knew that we were there, and, it's like, well, they could take liberties here and there because us guys in the back are going to kind of try to pull it all together and make sense of it.
Yeah.
And Kurt Busiek was phenomenal at doing that, as taking the things that seem to be contradictory and putting out stories that actually explain the fact that those contradictions actually work together. I mean, his Avengers Forever stuff. How could there be?
Oh my God, that is one of my favorite. That's my the pinnacle of time space stories. I love that.
How could there be two Human Torches? One that continued on, was found and dug up, and the other one that became the Vision. How is that possible? How can you make sense of those two? And then he did a brilliant way. He came up with a brilliant way of doing that. So it's that kind of work that I really admire. Folks like that, creators like that, who have a respect for the existing continuity, but can be creative and make use of that continuity and use it as the building blocks for something incredible.
Because so you've mentioned Kurt Busiek, you've mentioned and Wolverine being like a very complex character to document. Are there other writers, whether they're current or maybe from the past, that have done a really good job of complementing like continuity or making your jobs easy? And as far as characters too, besides Wolverine, is there another character that's like really just agonizing to try to timeline?
Oh man, with the writers, I think there are a number of writers. I mean, Roy Thomas was great back in his day, no doubt about that. I think as far as artists and their depictions, I mean, George Perez is just like you know,
that dude is godly. That dude's a demigod.
Now, my favorite, I had to say, if I were to pick a favorite artist of all time worked for Marvel, it would be Sal Buscema. I just think what he does is just so clean. I just really admired his work, and so artists that have come along that have kind of mimicked that particular look, I really liked. Characters that are really complex. You know, of course, you've got your time traveling characters, and time travel is like just like messes the heck out of everything because not
only was Kang.
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 There we go. Kang is like, you know, it's like, oh, it's Ramatut, it's Immortus, it's Scarlet Centurion, it's this, it's that. It's like, okay, dude, how do you actually piece together this person's life when it jumps around from persona to persona and time period to time period? So that's a classic example of something that's extremely difficult to nail down because his chronology does not go in chronological order if you were to follow his life. So time travel and those characters that tend to do that, like, you know, the Cables and all that kind of stuff, I mean, it just kind of... They're rather difficult to do. It's a lot easier to do with some of the characters who haven't had a lot of titles that you have to reconcile. Of course, Spider-Man, he's rather easy, but what complicates him is the fact that he's had a number of titles running at the same time. And so, you know, you have to say, okay, this run of this particular title had to come before or after this other run of this other title.
Clone Saga stuff?
The Clone Saga stuff. The Clone Saga, interestingly enough, is when I started really collecting Spider-Man, like every issue of every comic that was coming out with Spider-Man. Because it's like you couldn't avoid it. So that's one of, you know, the challenges in doing this stuff is just some of the fun, as far as I'm concerned. It's like, you know, some characters are really easy to do. It's those challenging characters that, you know, it's like appear a lot in a lot of places. Cap is one of my favorites, and he's all over the place. And it's, you know, paying attention to those little details. You know, what costume is this person wearing? Is this person have, you know, lost his arm or not? Or, you know, it's like these little clues about their relationships with other people that kind of, you know, help you kind of piece together, well, this couldn't have happened after this because of this, that, and the other thing. And then sometimes we run into situations where A has to happen before B, B has to happen before C, but C has to happen before A. And we have to work that out. And they happen every now and then. But, you know, we kind of think of ways to do that. There was one thing. Sometimes we have to ignore things in the comics altogether. There was a run of West Coast Avengers, I think, where... Tigra was shrunk down by Hank Pym, but then she appeared somewhere else full-sized and couldn't have done that at the time. And it's like, you know, it's like, okay, how do we explain this? And there was just some scenes that were like, okay, ignore that part. It's not canon. It actually didn't take place the way it was depicted in the comic. Those are few and far between, and the fact that it's few and far between, it gives a lot of credit to Marvel and their creators.
With this much detail, you can actually enjoy.
I was just about to say that. Yeah,
yeah. You know,
wait a minute.
and I want to add to that. What's the appeal? Because I mean, me and Ed are sitting here scratching our head, like, why would you do this to yourself?
Yeah.
Like,
well, you know,
because I mean, and I'm sorry, real quick, Paul. This isn't the work. And I mean, if we're going to be honest, this isn't the work that's the sexy work. You know, this isn't the creative side. This isn't you dictating where this character goes.
Yeah.
What's the appeal to documenting these characters' histories and these complex, convoluted timelines,
and then trying to tie them together?
Well, you know,
make them make sense.
It's a puzzle.
Yeah.
And if you're a big fan of puzzles, you like taking all of these pieces that Marvel's thrown out there and putting it all together in a different way than you're used to. Now, the way I would approach comics is I would get them home, I would read them for the sheer enjoyment of reading them, and then I'd go back over them and then start, I'd have it open, I'd have my computer open, and then I'm putting all the notes into my master Marvel calendar on that. And so on the one hand, I enjoyed it on one level, and then on the other hand, I'm like digging deep into it and enjoying it on a whole different level.
Wow.
So one thing that we haven't gotten a chance to kind of touch on is that you've been a museum curator for a while now, right?
Yeah.
I think
my entire professional career has been as a museum curator.
Your tie into Jacksonville, at least currently right now, is that you're curator over at MOS, the Museum of Science and History.
That's correct.
And I think I found an article of, it was like you were the chief curator over there in the Wisconsin?
Wisconsin Historical Society. I was chief curator there. Yep.
So, I mean, it's got to go hand in hand, right?
Yeah, because a lot of what we do is with museum work, especially if you're a curator, you collect material and then you have to document it. And you have to basically do the detective work about what the story was behind this object, the circumstances surrounding its manufacture, its provenance or history of ownership, piecing together all of those parts from different kinds of source materials. I would go to things like old business directories, city directories. I would do genealogical research in some cases to find out how things might have passed down from one generation to another in a family, and piecing together a story for an object that is not telling you what its story is. So my mind is kind of very registrarial in that case. It's basically chronicling, those kinds of things. So the work that I do professionally kind of ties into the way I'm approaching comics in a very real sense. It's that same kind of approach, methodical, kind of do the research, find out how all the pieces fit together.
Would you ever consider going about it from the creative aspect? Because I imagine with your knowledge and insight into these characters, I don't know, as intimately as you know them, I mean, I imagine that there's probably a story or two that you've got in your head that you wish would have been written.
Have you sent any scripts over?
No, I've never done that. And I was perfectly happy, and quite honestly, I've only had the time to devote to kind of the back of house work of doing this documentation. If I were to try to devote the time, and I don't consider myself particularly creative, it's really two sides of the brain, and the creative folks are kind of using that. The stuff that I'm doing for Marvel is really the other side of the brain. And so, I wouldn't say that I would make a tremendous creator.
Or not even so much the story, but like just a broad scenario that you would like to see. Like,
like just mapping out kind of a storyline. It's like, following up on, the events of such and such, wouldn't it be
characters that haven't really interacted that you would like to see?
I imagine you'd be a great consultant. Like, some of these writers need it. Looking at you, Bendis.
Yeah.
He's a DC now, so he's all right.
I know, he's found another nest to burn.
I have not said anything about Brian. He is tremendously creative.
He is.
But those of us who do the work that we do are constantly pulling our hair out.
Oh my God, I'll bet.
It's like, Brian, this is great, but oh my God.
I just imagine a room full of you guys, like, for some reason, calculators going for some reason, maps, charts, all of these, like, just papers all over the floor, and then you guys turn on the TV and it's like, Marvel to relaunch with all new #1s in May, and you're like, God damn it!
we have been known to kind of go, we're kind of working together, and it's like Bendis.
I was curious. I was curious too. We touched on it a little bit, but do you have this critical eye with other media, like animation or the movies or the Netflix shows?
I have been a big fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But before we get onto that, though, too, before I forget, there is one creative thing that I did do for Marvel, and it was kind of cool. You know how they have number designations for all the realities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of them actually came from me.
Which one?
That is the Taco Bell verse. Now, it's the very last entry in the Thor index.
Every stoner listener that we have right now is listening attentively.
But there was a Taco Bell exclusive collector's edition of Thor #1 that was done in 2009. Right. So when we were compiling stuff for the Thor trade paperback index, we wanted to tie in everything that Thor kind of starred in. So not just his main title, but all the other stuff too. Thunderstrike, et cetera, et cetera. So, they were doing the entry for this Taco Bell book, right? With the idea that it's an ad for Taco Bell.
I gotta look this up.
But they had to indicate who the characters were in this, and of course, it's not 616 Thor. It's Thor from another reality. So it's like, does anybody have a good idea for a numbered designation for this reality? And this was in 2011. If you recall, in 2011, there was a lawsuit brought against Taco Bell. The lawsuit claimed that their meat was only 35% beef.
Filler.
Right?
Yeah.
Only 35% beef.
Not surprised.
And the spokesperson for Taco Bell came back and said, no, it's 88% beef.
Oh. How dare you?
I mean, to his point, that's a good amount of...
That's more than twice, So I said, guys, the number designation for the Taco Bellverse is 3588.
3588.
3588. Awesome. And so it's now canon. It's reality 3588. You can look it up.
That's hilarious.
Paul, you're doing the Lord's work, Paul. That's all I can say, dude. So, all right. Is there any other, besides Marvel, is there any other comic company that is doing a solid job of continuity, or was there ever like a series or story arc that you were like, okay, that's pretty impressive, whether it's DC or Dark Horse, Image, Vertigo, etc.?
The one thing that I got into, the only other company that I really collected was, and I'm blanking out on it. In the 90s, Marvel bought up the rights to
Not Malibu.
Malibu.
Oh, Malibu.
Okay.
Malibu, and I'm like, oh, Malibu. I'm starting to see stories that kind of cross over with Avengers and with some of these Malibu characters, and I'm like, oh, who are these characters? So, I started going through the bargain bins and stuff and collecting Malibu comics, and found that, oh, wow, I was kind of really enjoying these. And they were paying a lot of attention to continuity in their own particular universe. And I was really totally geeking out then when they were kind of bringing some of the storylines and whatnot from that universe into mainstream Marvel at the time, and it was working. And of course, more recently when they brought Angela over and made her a Marvel character. But, I only have passing familiarity with some of these other companies, and it's usually because of these connections with Marvel. For the sake of my own sanity and my own time, I was devoting just so much time to Marvel stuff that I'm like, I just have to kind of
That's fair.
put on some blinders here and not pay a lot of attention to what DC is doing over here or Image is doing over there, et cetera, et cetera.
Did you do look at any of the Epic line or the New Universe line stuff?
I really wasn't into the Epic or New Universe lines, although, of course, they did kind of bring those back in more recently and, designated them as alternate realities as well. And I did collect a few of those comics, but I never really got into them.
Okay.
And one reason was, again for me, I don't approach it in quite the same way that a lot of comics guys do. It's like, okay, it could be a great story, great artist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But given my limited time, it's like, is this a story that matters? Is this a story that's going to tie into the work that I'm doing? And if not, I'm going to have to pass on it.
Gotcha.
Man. Was there a time frame in Marvel Comics history that's your particular favorite, whether it's maybe the 70s or 80s?
Bronze Age.
Yeah. And what's defined as a Bronze Age? What's the time frame?
Basically, 1970 to 85. That's when I really started collecting at the very beginning of the Bronze Age, and of course, the things that you're doing, you're reading as a kid, as a teenager, and it's like, wow, it has a special place.
Yeah.
And there are lots of elements of those stories that I can remember, kind of page by page and frame by frame, that when I only had enough money to collect like 4 books a month and whatnot, you spent more time on them. As time went by and, I started collecting more and more stuff, the time you end up spending all this stuff, you just kind of, and a lot of stuff just kind of blurs in my memory, from the 90s, 2000s and whatnot. They just kind of all, and and it doesn't help that they all kind of involve cycles. It's like, okay, let's take the main characters and give those identities to other people, and then the original people come back, and then we do it again. And so Marvel's done that quite a number of times, and it's hard for me to kind of remember which cycle was this on again, and what major event. What are the chronology of all the major events that have come up that have brought all the characters from the universe together. It's just kind of so my fond recollections are really for kind of the simpler stories, the greater characterization, the fewer kind of mega events.
Yeah, crossovers.
When they had crossovers, it tended to be like, one person coming into another person's book, and you could really explore those relationships a lot more than, having a million people in the comic. Not to say that I'm not tremendously excited about the upcoming Avengers movie, but those particular comics, I think because of the stage of life I was in when I read them, have a special place for me. And the artists and the writers of that period of time will kind of always be my favorites.
Man. When I think about... just my own, how I painted or got familiar with the Marvel timeline and continuity, I definitely got to give credit to the old Essential books, the black and whites, because I got into I got into comic books through the Onslaught saga. Like my dad gave me the Spider-Man tie-ins, and I loved those. And then he would just buy me the Essential books because they were cheap. They'd have a bunch of stories, and they were, for him, he was like, "Hey, these are essential. You got to read these, and then it'll make sense." So I'm super thankful for books like the Essential books, where they're not flashy, they're not the sexiest books. They're not collected in the best conditions, but like that stuff's just essential for even now. Like I might not know what's going on with Spider-Man, but I know the core stories. I know
it's
what
a lot cheaper than trying to track down those
absolutely.
Oh, you got it.
Yeah.
And talking with you, I'm getting a greater appreciation for these indexes and these handbooks, because I'll be honest, when I was going to conventions and stuff, you'd see these indexes and the $5 bins or the dollar bins really cheap, and for me, I was just like,
it's too many words.
Yes.
I want to see pictures, more pictures.
I was like, there's no way I can. I'd rather. For me, it was always, I'd rather just read these stories. I'd rather read these stories. But I think just getting an insight into the labor of love, because it's got to be a freaking labor of love, and the intensity and what you guys are looking at. Like you guys are. Like Ed said, how do you appreciate, how do you enjoy the comic book when you are painstakingly reviewing
picking it apart? Yeah.
And we've because the podcast really started when the movie started amping up, and we'd always try to find story arcs to recommend to people. Hey, this is a good jumping point. But Marvel always made it easy for us because they would relaunch every damn year for a movie. And I've never thought about just telling someone, hey, if you have the time, check out an index. You don't even. I'm sure you don't even need to read the whole thing.
I don't
I'm
think
sure
we've recommended an index.
No, and I feel like really ashamed right now. But this is why I wanted to have you on, Paul. Was that we've had writers, we've had artists, we've had editors, we've had people who've worked like the business side of comic books, but no one that's ever looked at it from as a living piece of history or a living piece of art to document. Yeah. 'Cause we're always talking about how comic books, they can be cheesy, they can be a fad, especially now. It can comic books seem to be the marketing tool behind the movies.
But it's the mythology behind it.
And it's great to see that there's a group of people like yourself that love it so much that you're willing to do the work that hell, not even Marvel would do. It sounds like they're the ones like Marvel.
You guys got this. You got it.
Exactly. Clean up our mess. So I wanted to ask one more question before we go on break, and because you had mentioned it at your introduction, was you are exclusively Marvel. Like that's what you were collecting. That's what you know and love. And you kind of explained it that with the research and the amount of dedication that you kind of had to choose. Hey, this is just going to be what I focus on. But is there any other element to these Marvel characters outside of just your appreciation for the continuity that maybe really made you stick by them?
Yeah, well, the fact that right from the beginning I was Marvel and Marvel exclusive. As a kid I could have gone, I'll collect these DCs, but you have to sort of understand when I was first collecting comics, this was, back in 69, 70, you compare Marvel to what DC was at the time. You've got incredible characterization. You've got these complex characters. It wasn't kind of, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And, you got to really appreciate and identify with a lot of the characters in those stories. And that's what I thought was really rich about the Marvel Universe, continuity aside. It's like these are characters you wanted to follow from one issue to another, from one title to another. And for me, that's really what did it. These people had lives. Their daily lives made a difference. And, you know, if they were heroes, they weren't these paragons of virtue.
They were flawed heroes.
They were flawed heroes. They had real problems. And they didn't necessarily get along with one another. And it's like real life. And so that's one thing that I appreciated right from the get-go about Marvel and continue to all throughout. And I know that, you know, DC did a lot of catching up with that throughout the 70s and 80s. But by that time, it's like, I don't need to bother. I'm going to stick with what I know.
Yeah. I was also, too, just since you've been a fan for so long, how do you feel about how, I guess, mainstream these characters you grew up with have become in the last 10 years or so? Like,
I was talking to Darren Jensen of the Marvel Chronology Project just yesterday on the phone, and it's like, dude, we spent like 2 hours talking about the movies. It's like, dude, if you'd have told us back in back in the day that this would be the biggest movie franchise of all time. Yeah. You've got TV tie-ins, you've got all this stuff going on, and that it has this mainstream acceptance. You're just like, you're out of your flipping mind. It's like, you know, it's like back in my day when I was young, it's like, you know, you collected comics and you kind of kept that a secret.
Totally.
You know,
when I was cool
to be a nerd now.
Yeah, and it's like I was ahead of my time. Who knew it?
So I was asking before. So when you approach the movies, especially now, since like the newer movies there's some actual reverence to the source material, unlike some of the things that came out 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
But can you enjoy it like that initial comic read, or do you still have that critical eye when you watch the movies as you do, as far as continuity, as far as character?
You know, I'm with the movies, I am enjoying them more as a fanboy than as a kind of chronologist on this. I am just totally geeking out with every movie and TV show that comes out. It's like, oh man, and it's like, and having the history that I do with this, knowing the little nuggets that they throw in for the people who know, and people who don't know, it just kind of just goes right over their head. But it's like, you know, I watched the first episode of Jessica Jones the other day, season 2, and they're mentioning they just made a passing reference to Maynard T-Bolt. And I'm like, I know who that is. And it's like, that is awesome.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, like when I was watching Daredevil and you see the who eventually is, you know, Gladiator. You see the symbol on his board. You see the buzzsaws.
Yeah.
And what's cool with the Marvel stuff, the MCU stuff, is they pay it off. They don't just throw it in there and not, you know, pay it off eventually. Yeah. So I'm excited to see all that stuff. So it's really cool.
Paul, like I said, unfortunately, our listeners are not privy to see the image I'm seeing in front of me of all these indexes and handbooks on the table, which is making the table like lean one way because they're so heavy. But among all of these books, is there any one of these that you have a fond memory, or maybe you're more attached to than the rest? Maybe your favorite one to work on?
I'd have to say, because my longstanding love for Avengers and for Captain America, those were the ones that I found most enjoyable doing. Always loved Avengers. The one arc that I wrote up was for Captain America was the Secret Empire saga from the 70s, which was inspired by, you know, Richard Nixon. And, you know, I remember reading that as a kid and thinking, wow, you know, this is really relevant. It ties in everything. And then going back, you know, and it's like, I've got dibs on this run because I have such great memories of it. And then going back and reading it again and taking these excruciating notes for the index, and it's like, I'm just loving it all over again. So it's those kinds of experiences that I've had with those titles that I really remember loving as a kid and revisiting them as an adult, kind of with all of this, everything that's happened since, and kind of looking back on it from that perspective has just been, you know, so totally enjoyable for me. And really have appreciated the work that I did. Marvel gave me a chance to do on the indexes, and if they announce that indexes are coming back, I'm there.
Yes. Awesome. Marvel, please bring those back. Let's go on music break. We'll come back. We'll talk some more of Marvel and indexes, and then we'll jump into our champion season. All right, stay tuned. Wait, Paul, you can't just say stuff like that when I don't have the record button on. Now pretend like you had never said that, and we'll act astounded one more time.
Oh my god!
Wait, wait, Paul, you were sharing while we were on break your theories about the new Avengers movies coming out and some of the aftermath of that. You said the word Fantastic Four, which made me perk my ears. Can you repeat that theory for our listeners?
Well, since they now have the rights to use Fantastic Four, and of course we saw that Avengers Tower was kind of destroyed, and the theory is that it's going to be recreated. And what's that going to be now? I think that I wouldn't be at all surprised, and I would be totally delighted to see during the movie, not in the credits, but during the movie, as a panoramic shot of New York, you're panning past the old Avengers Tower, and they're putting a big 4 on it.
That's a hot take.
They're putting a big 4 on it.
I see that.
4 Freedoms Plaza. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Fantastic Four yet exist in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because Reed Richards and company can, he's rich with patents.
Yes.
He's putting this together as his headquarters, et cetera, et cetera. So, it doesn't, and you don't need actors in there. You don't have to have that kind of commitment. But since this is so recent news, that it's something that could easily be put into the movie to tease that out. So
you heard it here first. That is a hot take.
Not that I know anything, but
Paul, I stepped
he's
away.
He's worked for Marvel.
Yeah,
guys.
exactly.
He might have
actually
some,
might be legit.
A little.
Paul,
that's total theory.
I stepped away for 2 minutes, came back, and you basically populated my entire apartment floor with a fold-out. What was it? It had at least 120 folds. Whatever this thing that you did.
It's a 12-foot long wall chart. The Marvel Expanding Universe wall chart. And what it is on one side, it shows you a lot of the major characters in the Marvel Universe within their own kind of spheres of influence and how those spheres of influence intersect one another. So you have everything from kind of Fantastic Four part of the universe to Spider-Man verse, and you have kind of the supernatural part with Doctor Strange and all the monsters and all that kind of stuff. And so on the other side are all of these character synopses, these short little paragraphs of all the characters that you're seeing on the wall chart, what the heck their story is. And so that was one of the awesome. Last things that I worked on for Marvel.
Paul, I don't think you understand how high you set the bar for other guests to come with reference material, example, your portfolio. Man, this has been eye-opening. Paul, I had asked you during the break if you could take some time to think about this question, and it was, do you have any bizarre Marvel facts or interesting trivia that maybe most people don't know, or that you use at parties to break the ice?
Did you know? It's hard for me to know kind of what is one of those really super trivial kinds of things that no one would know.
Is there one for Captain America that maybe most people would get misconstrued, like a fact that?
Well, of course, one of the things that I really found fascinating was
Capwolf. I knew it.
Yeah, Capwolf. Capwolf.
Yes.
Cap was a werewolf. Now, actually, Sam Wilson was a werewolf at one time too.
Whoa.
Sam Wolf.
Sam Wolf. But of course, Captain America sort of becoming a totally different superhero, Nomad. That's a character I wish they would do something with.
I was hoping to see those yellow discs in the
yeah, because I would love, that Captain America of the 1950s, and I don't know that a lot of people really know that story, but there was a college professor who really idolized Captain America, and with all of the communists in the 1950s and sort of that genre, decided it's time again for Captain America, and he injected himself with the super soldier serum, but forgot or neglected to take the Vita rays that Steve Rogers had, and the fact that he didn't take them meant that he was going mentally ill, and he was basically just kind of losing it, and he would basically just gang up on people for no reason, start beating them up and things like that, seeing communists everywhere, which is really kind of a metaphor for what was going on in the McCarthy era, which is great. But then they reintroduced him in the 1970s in the mainstream Cap as kind of who is this Captain America coming around and beating up, black people at the time?
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, so given, what we know is going on today regarding police brutality, that kind of thing, it's kind of worthwhile kind of looking back, seeing this guy who has who wants to basically expunge, all of these undesirable elements, so to speak, from America.
It's like a hard right.
It's a
Captain
hard right,
America.
alt-right kind of Captain America. And his Bucky at the time, this guy was like insane. This Captain America basically had
the skinhead Bucky.
Had the Cap of the 50s actually had this operation to actually look just like Steve Rogers. So he's like the spitting image of Steve Rogers. And then Jack Monroe was his Bucky in the 1950s. And then in the 1970s, after some security guard, they were in the deep freeze in cryogenesis. And after reading about Nixon going to China and what's happening with the United States and everything else, decided to free the 50s Cap and Bucky and send them out into the world to do the good work. And so it wasn't long before, he ran afoul of Steve Rogers and whatnot. And it was a real play on kind of politics, on world outlook, et cetera, et cetera. But the Bucky of the 1950s ended up becoming Nomad, which was a character that was introduced by Steve Rogers in the 1970s when he quit being Captain America, because he was, of course, the president of the United States in the Marvel Universe, patterned after Richard Nixon, was behind the Secret Empire saga. And when he was exposed, he shot himself dead in the White House. And Cap was so disillusioned by that he decided that he was just going to quit being Captain America altogether. Someone convinced him that, well, you shouldn't stop fighting the good fight. You just can't be Captain America anymore. So he adopted that Nomad.
Not wear the colors of
flag.
Yeah,
not wearing the colors of the flag. And one of the funniest things I remember from comics is, he designs himself a new costume, and it has a flowing cape because, Cap never had a cape before. So it's like, Thor and those guys, they look really cool in capes, Yeah. So, I'm going to make this cape. It was a great looking cape, too. It was blue on the outside and yellow on the inside.
Yellow and blue colors.
And so on his very first mission, the bad guys are getting away. He gives pursuit. He trips over the cape. He falls flat on his face, and he rips the cape up. So, that's one of my fondest memories. I was like, okay, even Steve Rogers makes mistakes sometimes. So that's something that people may not be familiar with. But that's a character that, I hope they would introduce into the cinematic universe at some point.
God,
I was thinking that when he started wearing all black towards the end of Civil War, I thought they were going to kind of go with that Nomad type character.
Yeah.
I just want to keep throwing like random characters at you. Give me the bio.
U.S. Agent. Thoughts?
Oh, I love U.S. Agent.
I love his. He was the first Captain America toy I had as a kid. Was U.S. Agent. And I thought that was
Captain America. And that was fantastic. And of course, U.S. Agent. There was another period of time when basically the government took away Steve Rogers' identity as Captain America, handed it over to someone called the Super Patriot. And Super Patriot was expected to be Captain America. That's one of my favorite runs of Captain America, by the way, because you have this guy who's trying to fill shoes that are unfillable.
Yeah.
And his Bucky was African American and bigger than he was.
You want me to take orders from who?
Bigger than he was. It wasn't long before, finally Steve Rogers came back to becoming Captain America. What happened to that character? What happened to that Captain American Bucky? That Captain America became U.S. Agent. His outfit was kind of this black with this star on it and kind of a little bit of a flag on it. Bucky became Battlestar, and they kind of had their the new Captain America, the U.S. agent, was reintroduced into the comic world in West Coast Avengers, became a West Coast Avenger around the time that the original Human Torch was brought back and became the West Coast. That's one of my favorite runs of West Coast Avengers. But I always have had a soft spot for U.S. Agent and his own particular take on being Captain America. And, of course, he went on to other things, and he lost some limbs later on, and et cetera, et cetera. But you know, so really enjoyed that run. And, of course, afterward, at a later date, Captain America, Steve Rogers, again gives up when he stopped being Captain America and Super Patriot became Captain America. He found that he couldn't give up crime fighting, and so he became the captain. And the captain basically has the same uniform as U.S. agent. That's where it came from.
Okay, I always got confused about this too.
Yeah.
You and my dad would be best friends with all this Cap talk. This is what he does. He takes up the mic and he talks Captain America bio. Paul, Ed, I want to go ahead and jump into our champion season. Champion season, for your first time tuning in, is the segment of the show where we go around the table and everyone gets a chance to highlight a couple things within pop culture that's really resonated with us this week. So this could be a movie, a television series, a comic book, just about anything that we feel, hey, this is awesome and you should check it out too. Paul, we got a rule. Guests go first. What do you want to champion today?
Jessica Jones season 2.
Oh, good choice.
Out of all of the Netflix series, I think Jessica Jones season 1 was my favorite one.
Yeah.
I thought David Tennant was phenomenal.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, he'll be making an appearance in season 2, I think episode 8. Haven't gotten that far yet. But I've seen the first couple of episodes. I really love the characterization. I love the way the stories are set up and paced on that program. And of course, the little nuggets I shared with you, the Maynard T-Bolt one. A certain character is introduced in season 1, and if you're familiar with the Invaders,
which version? Oh, the Invaders,
the original Invaders, or the original Squadron Sinister or Supreme, you'll probably know a character that I'm talking about.
Nighthawk?
And I don't want to give it away.
Oh, okay.
But he appears. He's a different person in this, but the same character with the same power appears in that first episode, and I just totally geeked out about that. And there was also a reference in there to people who are really geeked out about his pet. He has a pet in there, and I'll talk to you guys offline about it because I don't want to spoil it for everybody. But just having that character in there was just kind of just set me over the moon for that one. But I really love the actors in that series. I think it's going to be just about as good as the first season, judging from the first couple of episodes. Highly recommend it because Jessica Jones is just dealing with the fact that she killed Kilgrave, and everyone's coming to her as kind of this super vigilante who does not hesitate to kill. Yeah. And that's not her, and she's getting pissed off about it.
Fantastic.
She's such a great character.
All right, Ed, what about you? What do you got to champion?
This one is non-comic book related, but it's actually a comedy, kind of a documentary comedy. It's called A Futile and Stupid Gesture. It's basically based on Doug Kinney, who's the founder of National Lampoon, the magazine, and then Animal House and movies. And basically, it's just based on a book about his life. And I wasn't familiar with him at all. I was familiar with the movies, the Lampoon movies, but I wasn't familiar with Doug Kinney himself. I think it's a really fun, even though it's has a tragic a life, but it's just cool kind of seeing as Will Forte plays Doug Kinney. Martin Mull plays kind of like an older version of Doug Kinney, who basically they kind of go back and forth when they're doing the biography. So it's done really well. I thought it was a good take on it. Kind of got me interested in looking into more of his history, and there's some stuff in there like his influence, kind of that basically wanted to do kind of like a Mad magazine for adults, for young adults, and then what kind of influenced. Eventually, you could see the influence of Saturday Night Live when it came out. But yeah, it's really cool. You can check it out on Netflix. Just came out maybe in January.
All right, word. You got anything else?
Nope, that's it.
All right. I've got two quick ones, and they're both comic related. Surprisingly, one of them is a DC comic, which is weird for an all. We've been talking Marvel heavy the whole time.
This is
goes
against all your principles.
I know. Somewhere my dad is shedding a tear, like that Indian in like those recycling trash commercials.
Single tear.
But no, it's a new number one. It's called The Terrifics. It's by Jeff Lemire and Ivan Reyes, and it was joked earlier as at least the fan community was joking that this was DC's response to Marvel Comics not having a Fantastic Four line, essentially. Because, I mean, when you look at it, it stars...
the Challengers of the Unknown.
Yeah, but that too.
Kind of.
So you got Mr. Terrific, Metamorpho, Plastic Man, and Phantom Girl. And when you look at their power sets, it's kind of like...
Yeah.
But... and it kind of follows the same kind of premise. They're brought together by tragic accident. They're stuck in a different, in that dark multiverse, the spinoff from the Batman series. So, but it was a fantastic first issue. I'm glad that they're highlighting Mr. Terrific because, I mean, in the DC universe, I think he's like the third smartest dude.
It's very weird. It's like he's the third smartest man. It's like, that's a weird stat. They kind of made Mr. Terrific, at least when I've last started really. I'm not sure what the new reboot it is now, but they kind of made him almost like a Tony Stark type.
Yeah, and it's an interesting lineup. I mean, I don't know much about Mr. Terrific. I don't know much about Metamorpho. Plastic Man is always fun to have in a comic, and I think Phantom Girl is either a new character or a really underused character. I think so, but it was a fantastic first.
Lemire is awesome.
Yeah, Jeff Lemire. You can't go wrong with Jeff Lemire. And it's Ivan Reyes, man. Like, the book is gorgeous. So that's the first one, and the second thing I'll champion is
that guy writes like 30 books a month.
I don't know if he's got like an exclusive deal with anyone. Like,
no, I don't know if he's one of that big Marvel kind of walkout of like all their big writers.
Yeah,
I don't know if he's one of them too, but he's.
Well, I'm sure that he'll be sticking with DC for a minute because, I mean, issue one just came out, and I'm looking forward to more. So that's a good one. And the other thing I'll champion is the current Darth Vader series that Marvel is putting out. It's up to issue 13, and it's still the same creative team. So Charles Soule doing the writing, and then I can never say the dude's name, but Giuseppe Camuncoli doing the pencils.
It's in Cree. It's your Cree pronunciation.
But it has been maybe the best Star Wars series or tie-ins that Marvel's been putting out. I know the regular Star Wars series is up to like issue 40 or something, but Darth Vader is still relatively young.
Yeah.
And it takes place right after movie 3. So he's just gotten his robotics. He's kind of still learning how to be, the Sith's like right-hand man, or etc. And the interesting thing they do throughout the course of these 13 issues is explain how he gets his lightsaber and what makes the Sith lightsabers different than the Jedi's. So it's fantastic. The art's fantastic.
It's the stuff that we wanted to see in the prequels.
Yeah, basically. So
didn't get to see, like especially Vader down, that storyline. That is. If you want to see Vader really just kicking ass.
Yeah.
Dude,
So, yeah, exactly. If you like that, then Darth Vader spin-off series is fantastic. Those will be the two I champion as the Terrifics #1 and the Darth Vader series currently right now. It's both really good stuff. Paul, I want to say again, thank you so much for finding time to come on here and get like comic book Marvel nerdy with us.
My pleasure.
It was great to get like I said, your point of view and your perspective on how you approach comics and the importance of continuity. Because sometimes I think we can forget that continuity plays such an important part, and I don't know of any other medium that takes continuity this seriously, other than maybe working at a museum or history buffs. But it's funny because you'll meet these comic book fans who take continuity so serious, and you're like, whoa, man, just calm down. They're just comic book characters. But you came on here very classy and opened up my eyes to why these indexes and these handbooks are important.
Yeah, definitely.
So I wanted to give you a chance to give a shout out to any of the people you work with, and maybe any of the projects that you'd like to put out, like the chronologic.
I want to say again, kudos to the folks working on the Marvel Chronology Project. It's painstaking work, but work that they all love. Russ Chappell and Jeff York and Darren Jensen.
What's the website again?
chronologyproject.com.
Okay.
And you'll also find a link there to the Marvel calendar, which is a work of mine there, and you can kind of see how totally nutty I am with the, I think it's years 20 to 24 that are on there month by month, day by day. So check it out.
Awesome. Ed, you got any shout-outs or anything you want to plug in?
Just my website, edbot5000.com, has all the links to everything there.
And also, I forgot, I went ahead and made some updates to the website, shortbackjacks.com. So I have a link to like Ashley's art page,
awesome.
Your page, Cesar's Twitter, Adam's art website, and etc. So if you like I've always been preaching, the website shortbackjacks.com is a great central hub to get in touch with any of us and also all of our links and stuff. So I'll wrap up by saying that shortboxjacks.com, it's got links to our SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher Radio. We're on Google Play. We're on iHeartRadio now. So
everywhere.
Anywhere that you can find podcasts, you can subscribe to the show. It's free. You can stay up to date with us on social media as well, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So, yeah, if you haven't joined the Shortbox Nation, join, follow. Paul, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
And to our listeners, we are approaching episode 200 really closely. So my goal for next episode is to finally get the crew back in. I know Ashley's been wanting to come back really bad, so we're going to try to organize a time.
She hiding bodies again?
She's done hiding bodies. So now that case got dropped. So my goal for next episode is to get the crew back. So Cesar, Ed, Ashley, Adam. So stay tuned. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week. Peace.